Get out of this bank right now! Out.
Get out of this bank right now. The shout cracked through the marble lobby like a whip, and every head in the building turned at once. A young bank teller had just struck an elderly black woman across the face, hard enough that the sound echoed off the high ceiling, and the only reason the woman had been standing at that counter in the first place was because she wanted to open a simple savings account. Humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, the old woman bent down slowly and picked up her worn leather bag from the floor. Nobody in that crowded lobby moved to help her. Nobody said a word in her defense. But less than 30 minutes later, a line of black luxury vehicles pulled up outside the bank's front doors, and when the truth about who she really was finally came out, every employee in that building went pale. The woman who had delivered the slap understood, in that single moment, that her career was already over. Her name was Martha Johnson, and on an ordinary Tuesday morning she was 72 years old, a widow who lived quietly in a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city, the kind of street where the houses were small, but the gardens were tended with care. She had lived in that same house for over 30 years, raising 2 children there, burying a husband there, watching the neighborhood slowly change around her while she herself stayed remarkably the same. She wore a coat that had seen better winters, soft at the elbows and slightly faded at the collar, a coat that had belonged to a version of her life. She still cherished, not because she could not afford a new one, but because it had belonged to a version of her life. She carried a handbag that had clearly traveled with her for decades, its leather worn smooth at the corners from years of being held the same way, tucked close against her side. That morning she rode the public bus into downtown, the way she always did, watching the city blur past the window with the patient calm of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. She had taken that same route more times than she could count, past the same bakery, the same dry cleaner, the same corner where a flower vendor set up his cart every morning, rain or shine. The driver knew her by name, and she always greeted him the same way, with a small nod and a quiet good morning that asked for nothing more than to be left to her thoughts for the ride. Tucked carefully inside her bag was a thin folder of documents held together with a rubber band, the kind of folder a person protects the way they might protect a photograph of someone they loved. She had checked twice before leaving the house that the folder was there, a small habit she had carried for years, though today, more than most days, its contents mattered. Her late husband used to tease her gently about that habit, telling her that no folder had ever once disappeared from a bag she was carrying, and she would always answer that it was not about the folder disappearing, but about being certain, about never leaving room for doubt, when doubt could so easily be avoided. She thought of him often on mornings like this one, the way his voice still seemed to follow her into rooms he had never actually entered, a steady presence she had learned to carry rather than mourn. The bus rattled gently over a familiar pothole near the old post office, and she barely noticed it anymore, her mind already several streets ahead, already standing in the lobby she was about to enter. She stepped off the bus 2 blocks from the largest bank in the city, a glass tower that gleamed under the morning sun, its revolving doors swallowing well-dressed men and women who barely glanced at one another as they passed through. The building rose nearly 40 stories above the avenue, its lobby designed to impress, with polished floors that reflected the light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, and a hush that seemed engineered to remind every visitor exactly how much money moved silently through that space each day. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling at careful intervals, and a fountain near the center of the lobby filled the air with a soft, constant trickle of water, the kind of detail meant to soothe people who had never once worried about whether their money would be treated with respect. Martha walked inside with the same unhurried steps she used for everything in her life, pausing for a moment, just past the entrance to take in the scale of the room, the way she always did in unfamiliar buildings, a habit left over from decades of walking into rooms, where she had to quickly understand exactly where she stood. Almost immediately, she felt the shift in the air, the subtle change that happens when a room decides, without a single word, that someone does not belong. It was nothing she could have pointed to directly, no single glance or gesture severe enough to complain about, only the accumulated weight of dozens of small calculations happening behind dozens of polite, professional faces. Tellers glanced at her coat, then at her shoes, then at each other, exchanging looks that needed no translation. A pair of well-heeled customers waiting nearby stepped back half a pace when she came to stand near them, as though her presence might somehow rub off on their morning. A young security guard near the door watched her a beat longer than he watched anyone else who had walked in that morning, his eyes following her all the way to the customer service line. Martha noticed all of it, the way she had noticed it 1,000 times before in her life. The slow accumulation of small slights that most people never had to learn to carry, and she let it pass over her the way rain passes over a stone that has weathered far worse storms. She kept the same gentle smile she always wore, the kind of smile that asked nothing of anyone and apologized for nothing either. It was the smile of a woman who had decided long ago that other people's assumptions were their burden to carry, not hers. Still, a few of the people watching that morning found themselves wondering, almost without meaning to, why an older woman dressed so plainly had come to a bank known for serving the wealthiest families in the city. What business could she possibly have here? They wondered, glancing again at her coat, her shoes, the bus pass still peeking from the side pocket of her bag. And what exactly was inside that worn folder she held so tightly against her chest, the way a person holds something they have waited a very long time to use? The teller assigned to greet new customers that morning was a young woman named Amanda Pierce, sharp-eyed and quick with her opinions, the kind of employee who had learned to judge a customer's worth within the first 3 seconds of eye contact and rarely bothered to revise that judgment afterward. Amanda had worked at the branch for nearly 2 years, and in that time she had developed an unspoken hierarchy in her mind, a system for sorting customers into those worth her full attention, and those who could wait, those whose business mattered, and those who, in her estimation, were simply passing through. When Martha approached the counter, Amanda's gaze swept over the old coat, the scuffed handbag, the bus pass still visible in the side pocket, and something in her expression curdled into open disdain, the corner of her mouth tightening into a thin, dismissive line. Rather than calling Martha forward, Amanda found small reasons to attend to other customers first, straightening papers that did not need straightening, taking a longer than necessary phone call about nothing in particular, letting 3 people who arrived after Martha be served ahead of her at the counter. Each time Martha's turn seemed to arrive, Amanda discovered some new task to occupy her hands, some reason the older woman could simply continue to wait. Martha said nothing through any of it. She simply found a seat near the window and waited, her hands folded over the folder in her lap, watching the minutes climb past 1 full hour without a flicker of impatience crossing her face, her eyes occasionally drifting to the city outside the glass, calm as still water. When her turn finally came, Amanda did not bother to hide her tone. She looked Martha up and down one more time before speaking, her eyes lingering deliberately on the frayed cuff of the old coat, and what came out of her mouth was less a greeting than a challenge. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, the corner of her mouth twitching upward into something close to a smirk. Martha simply replied, in the same even tone she had used all morning, that she would like to open an account. Amanda let out a short laugh, the kind meant to be heard by the people standing nearby, and asked, with theatrical patience, what amount the woman thought she would be depositing. When Martha answered that she intended to transfer a substantial investment, Amanda's laugh sharpened into something colder, and she said, loudly enough for 3 other tellers to hear, that she doubted very much that was true. She turned briefly toward her co-workers with a knowing look, the kind exchanged between people who believe they are sharing a private joke at someone else's expense, and one of them snorted quietly behind a raised hand. The whispers started almost immediately throughout the lobby. A businessman near the entrance lowered his newspaper just enough to watch the scene unfold. A young mother shifted her toddler onto her hip and stared, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. Nobody intervened, but several people in that lobby felt a flicker of unease they could not quite name, a sense that something about the scene in front of them was deeply, unmistakably wrong, even if none of them were brave enough to say so out loud. An older gentleman waiting near the loan department shifted in his seat as if to rise, then settled back down, deciding it was not his place. Martha kept her composure throughout, the folder still resting against her chest, her spine straight, her chin level, and waited for Amanda to ask the one question that might finally turn the morning around. Martha finally reached into her bag and drew out the folder, sliding it gently across the counter toward Amanda, her fingers steady despite everything that had already passed between them. Inside were carefully organized financial statements, signed letters, bearing the names of major corporations, and documentation that, to anyone willing to actually read it, would have answered every question in the room within seconds. The papers were neat, labeled, organized with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding exactly how important paperwork could be. Amanda did not open it. She barely glanced at the cover page before pushing it back across the counter with 2 fingers, as though she did not want to risk touching it for too long, declaring with total certainty that the woman in front of her was attempting some kind of fraud. Within moments, she had waved over 2 security guards stationed near the entrance, her voice rising in volume, as she announced to the gathering crowd that this elderly woman was clearly trying to scam the bank, that she had seen this kind of thing before, that people like this always had some story ready. Martha tried once more, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest, a heat born not of embarrassment, but of something closer to disbelief, that decades of dignity could be dismissed so quickly by someone barely a third her age. "If you would just look at the papers," she began, reaching toward the folder again, hoping that reason might still win out over assumption, that somewhere beneath the young woman's contempt, there might still be a willingness to simply look. But Amanda snatched the folder away before Martha's fingers could close around it, holding it just out of reach, as though it were evidence in a crime, rather than proof of a legitimate transaction. In the brief tug between them, something inside Amanda's composure finally broke, some final thread of professionalism, snapping under the weight of her own certainty that she was right. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. But it would be replayed in that bank's security footage for months to come, studied frame by people who would later have to explain exactly how it had been allowed to happen. Amanda's open palm struck Martha across the cheek with a crack loud enough to silence the entire lobby, the sound somehow louder than it should have been, swallowed up and amplified at once by the stunned hush that followed. For one suspended moment, nobody in that grand marble hall breathed. The businessman's newspaper hung forgotten in his hands. The young mother pulled her toddler closer without realizing she had done it. Even the other tellers, mid-conversation with their own customers, froze mid-sentence, their mouths still open around words that would never finish. "Get out of here right now!" Amanda screamed, her voice cracking with something between fury and panic, as though she already sensed, somewhere beneath her anger, that she had crossed a line from which there would be no quiet return, no simple apology that could undo what had just happened in front of so many witnesses. Martha stood perfectly still for several seconds, her cheek burning, her eyes glassy but dry, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of her tears. She had survived too much in her life to let this be the moment that broke her composure in public. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, calm, almost gentle, the voice of someone who had weathered far worse storms than this one, and had learned exactly how to carry herself through them without ever raising her own volume to match someone else's cruelty. "You are going to regret this," she said quietly, the words landing with more weight than any shout could have managed. And then she bent down to gather the folder Amanda had let fall to the floor in the commotion. Not everyone in that lobby had simply watched in silence. An older bank employee named David Reyes, who had spent nearly 20 years working behind those same counters, had seen the entire exchange unfold from a few desks away, and something about it had unsettled him from the very first moment. Amanda raised her voice. David had always been the kind of man who noticed things other people missed, the quiet details in a customer's posture, the small signs of dignity beneath a worn coat, and what he had seen in Martha from the moment she walked through the door had nothing in common with what Amanda seemed determined to believe. He crossed the lobby quickly, his own heart pounding with something close to shame on behalf of his coworker, and knelt beside Martha, beginning to help her gather the scattered papers from the floor, his hands moving with a respect that nobody else in that room had bothered to show her all morning. As he gathered the documents, His eyes caught fragments of what was printed on them. Glimpses he had not meant to read, but could not help noticing, once they were in his hands. Financial statements, with figures far larger than anything that crossed his desk in a typical year. Signatures belonging to executives whose names he recognized from business journals he sometimes read on his lunch break. A letter bearing the embossed seal of a corporate board of directors, dated only weeks earlier. David looked up at her, his expression shifting from concern into something closer to disbelief, the pieces of what he was holding, refusing to align with the woman who had just been slapped and screamed at in the middle of a public lobby. "Ma'am," he said carefully, lowering his voice so only she could hear him. "Who exactly are you?" Martha straightened her coat, accepted the folder back into her hands with a small nod of thanks, and offered him the same quiet, knowing smile she had carried since she first walked through the revolving doors that morning. "Just a woman who wanted to open an account," she said, and there was nothing in her tone that suggested she was hiding anything, even though every fiber of David's instincts told him there was a great deal more beneath the surface of that simple answer. What none of them yet understood was that Martha Johnson's story had begun more than 40 years earlier, in a decade when banks across the country routinely closed their doors to people who looked like her, when a loan application could be denied for reasons that were never written down but were understood perfectly well by everyone in the room. Back then, she had been a sharp, ambitious financial analyst, working long hours to understand markets that most people her age never bothered to study, staying late at the small firm that employed her, teaching herself things no one had offered to teach her, determined that her circumstances would not define the limits of her future. She had married a quiet, determined man named Walter Johnson, a former teacher with a head for numbers and a heart for fairness, and together they shared a belief that they could build something lasting from almost nothing, even when the entire system around them seemed designed to prove otherwise. In the early 1980s, Walter and Martha had tried to start a small investment firm of their own, certain that their combined knowledge and discipline could serve people the larger institutions overlooked. Instead, they were turned away from lender after lender, told politely, and sometimes not so politely, that people who looked like them simply did not qualify for the kind of capital they needed to get started. Doors closed in their faces in conference rooms across the city, loan officers who would not meet their eyes, promises made over handshakes that were quietly broken the moment Walter and Martha left the building. One bank manager had told them outright, without a trace of apology, that his institution did not typically extend this kind of credit to people in their position. And Martha had never forgotten the casual cruelty in the way he said it, as though he were simply stating a fact of weather, rather than a decision he himself had made. There were nights during those early years when Martha sat at the kitchen table, long after Walter had fallen asleep, going over the same numbers again and again by lamplight, searching for some arrangement of figures that might convince one more bank to say yes instead of no. She remembered the particular sting of watching younger, less experienced men walk into those same offices and walk out with approval within a week, men who had never once been asked to prove themselves the way she and Walter were asked to prove themselves every single time. She kept a small notebook from those years, its pages filled with names of lenders who had refused them, not out of bitterness, she always said, but so she would never forget exactly how far they had climbed. But Walter and Martha refused to stop. They pooled every dollar they had saved across years of careful living, borrowed small amounts from family members who believed in them when almost no one else would, and built their firm one client at a time, one careful investment at a time, surviving on faith and stubbornness during years when almost nobody believed they would last more than a season. They worked out of a cramped office above a laundromat for the first 3 years, the smell of detergent drifting up through the floorboards while they pored over spreadsheets late into the night, refusing every excuse to quit, even when their bank account dwindled to almost nothing more than once. Slowly, painstakingly, what had started as two people with nothing but conviction grew into a respected investment firm, then a regional name people began to trust. Then, over the following decades, into one of the most quietly influential private equity groups in the entire country. After Walter passed away nearly a decade earlier, following a long illness that Martha had nursed him through with the same patience she brought to everything else in her life, she had done something almost nobody expected. She had stepped back from public life entirely, handing day-to-day operations to a trusted team of executives while she lived simply, traveled rarely, and allowed the world to forget the face behind the name on the letterhead. She gave away more of her fortune in those years than most people would ever earn in a lifetime, quietly, without press releases or named buildings, because Walter had always believed that the truest measure of wealth was what it could do for someone else, not what it could say about the person who held it. Standing in that bank lobby with a stinging cheek, Martha Johnson was not the helpless figure Amanda had assumed her to be. She was, in fact, one of the wealthiest women in the entire state, though almost nobody walking past her that morning would have guessed it from her coat or her bus pass. The people gathered in that lobby were only beginning to sense, in flashes of unease they could not yet explain, that they had badly misjudged the woman standing among them, and that the morning was far from over. Roughly 30 minutes after Martha had been struck and ordered to leave, a procession of black sport utility vehicles rolled to a stop directly outside the bank's main entrance, drawing the attention of nearly everyone still inside the building. Employees who had returned to their desks after the incident, trying to pretend the morning had returned to normal, found themselves drifting toward the windows, curiosity pulling them away from their keyboards as car doors opened in perfect, practice sequence along the curb. Outside on the sidewalk, pedestrians slowed their pace to watch, sensing that whatever was unfolding inside that lobby was no longer an ordinary Tuesday morning. The first to step out were two attorneys in dark, tailored suits, their expressions unreadable, followed by a small team of financial advisors carrying tablets and folders of their own, and then several broad-shouldered security personnel who positioned themselves near the entrance with quiet, deliberate efficiency. A hush fell over the lobby, even before anyone understood exactly what was happening. The kind of silence that settles over a room, sensing something significant approaching, before a single word has been spoken. One of the younger tellers leaned toward a coworker and whispered a question neither of them could yet answer. Then the final vehicle's door opened, and a man whose face many of the bankers recognized immediately from business magazines and television interviews stepped out onto the sidewalk, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked. He was the chief executive of one of the largest investment management firms in the country, a man named Charles Whitfield, whose name alone could move markets, and whose presence in any building tended to rearrange the priorities of everyone inside it within seconds. He had flown in that morning the moment he received word of what had happened, canceling 2 other meetings without a second thought, because in his understanding of the world, very few things mattered more than standing beside someone who had stood beside him for years. He walked through the revolving doors with the unmistakable authority of someone who was used to rooms reorganizing themselves around his presence, and the first words out of his mouth landed like a thunderclap across the marble lobby. "Where is Mrs. Martha Johnson?" he asked, his voice carrying easily, almost effortlessly, to every corner of the room. Amanda, who had been quietly trying to disappear behind her counter for the last half hour, felt her stomach drop as every eye in the building turned first toward the executive, then, slowly, inevitably, toward her. The executive crossed the lobby directly to where Martha was still standing near the window, gently smoothing the wrinkles from her coat as if nothing unusual had happened to her at all. He stopped in front of her, and to the visible astonishment of everyone watching, lowered his head in a respectful bow before greeting her warmly by name, his entire posture shifting into something close to reverence. Gasps rippled through the lobby in waves. Customers who had been waiting in line abandoned their place entirely to watch. Tellers who had spent the last hour pretending not to notice the situation now stared openly, their professional composure cracking under the sheer weight of what they were witnessing unfold in front of them. It took only a few sentences from the executive for the full truth to settle over the room like a slow, spreading chill. Martha Johnson, he explained, was the founder and majority owner of one of the most respected private investment funds in the country, a fund with billions of dollars under management and influence, reaching into industries most of the people in that lobby had never thought to connect to a single quiet woman in an old coat. She held significant shares in dozens of companies represented by the very people now filling that lobby, board seats that carried real weight, relationships built over decades of careful, deliberate decision-making. For years, she had quietly funded major philanthropic projects across the region: schools, scholarship programs, community health centers, while deliberately keeping her own name out of any headline, preferring her generosity to remain invisible rather than turned into spectacle. The executive turned to address the stunned crowd of bank employees directly, his voice rising just enough to make certain everyone heard him with absolute clarity. "Mrs. Johnson," he announced, "was here this morning to discuss transferring more than $50 million into accounts with this institution." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning and someone's phone vibrating uselessly in a pocket. Amanda's face had gone the color of paper, her hands trembling at her sides, the full scope of what she had just done finally crashing down on her all at once. Word of the unfolding scene reached the bank's regional president within minutes, and he arrived in the lobby looking as though he had aged several years in the short walk from his office on the upper floors. He immediately requested access to the morning's security footage, demanding it be pulled up before he had even finished crossing the room, and what played back on the small screen in the back office left him visibly shaken. The slap delivered in crisp, undeniable clarity. Martha's calm dignity throughout every minute of her wait. Amanda's escalating hostility from the very first moment the elderly woman had approached the counter, captured from 3 different angles, with nothing left open to interpretation or excuse. There was no ambiguity left in the footage, no version of events that could be softened or quietly explained away to anyone who watched it. He watched the recording twice, his jaw tightening further the second time through, pausing on the frame where Amanda's hand made contact, studying it the way a man studies a wound to understand exactly how deep it runs. Beside him, a compliance officer who had been with the bank for over a decade said quietly that she had never once, in all her years reviewing footage of customer disputes, seen anything quite this clear-cut, this impossible to defend in any meeting, any hearing, any conversation with the press that might come calling before the day was finished. The president rubbed his temples and asked, almost to himself, how something like this had been allowed to happen inside a building with his name attached to its reputation. What the bank president did not yet realize, standing there with his stomach in knots over a viral disaster waiting to unfold, was that the morning's events reached far beyond a single act of cruelty caught on camera. Martha's investment fund had spent the past several months in private discussions with senior bank leadership about becoming a strategic partner, an arrangement that would have included purchasing a substantial stake in the bank itself, the kind of partnership that could reshape the institution's standing in the financial world for years to come. Those negotiations, worth hundreds of millions of dollars and months of careful planning, now hung by the thinnest possible thread, threatened entirely by 20 seconds of cruelty, unfolding on a lobby floor that morning. As the implications spread through the executive offices upstairs, panic took hold among senior leadership in a way few of them had ever experienced. Phone calls flew between departments. Lawyers were summoned before lunch. Public relations officers scrambled to understand exactly how much damage had already been done and how much more was still to come, knowing that no apology crafted in a boardroom could undo what dozens of witnesses had already seen with their own eyes. The president personally walked back into the lobby, his tie slightly loosened, his composure barely holding, and approached Martha with the kind of careful humility usually reserved for the most important meetings of his career. Amanda, watching her entire professional world collapse in real time, finally broke down completely. She rushed toward Martha with tears streaming down her face, repeating apologies that tumbled over one another, shuffling, insisting she had not meant for things to go so far, begging for some kind of second chance, some way to undo the last hour of her life. Martha listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, allowing the young woman every word she needed to say, until Amanda finally fell silent, breathless, waiting for some sign of forgiveness or reprieve that did not come. Martha studied her for a long moment before speaking, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm, carrying easily across the hushed lobby to every person still standing frozen in place. "The most painful part of this morning was not the slap," she said, each word measured and deliberate. "It was watching you decide what I was worth, based only on what I looked like. The words landed harder than the hand ever had, settling over the room with a weight that no amount of apology could lift, because everyone present understood, in that instant, exactly how true it was. Within the hour, Amanda was formally terminated from her position, escorted from the building under the same eyes that had once watched her humiliate an elderly customer without a single consequence. Two supervisors, who had stood by and said nothing during the entire incident, were placed under internal review for their failure to intervene, when intervention had clearly been possible. The bank's leadership issued a public apology within the day, acknowledging what had happened and promising accountability, though everyone in that lobby understood the apology had come only because the wrong person had finally been recognized, not because anyone had truly understood what was wrong from the start. A quiet round of applause rippled through the remaining customers as Amanda was led out through the same revolving doors Martha had once walked through that morning, the irony lost on no one. In the corner, David Reyes received handshake after handshake from colleagues who had watched him be the only one willing to kneel down and help an old woman pick papers up off the floor, a small act that had suddenly become the most important thing anyone in that building had done all year. Several weeks later, the bank had visibly changed in ways that went beyond a single firing and a single apology. New mandatory training programs had been introduced for every employee, focused specifically on recognizing and confronting unconscious bias in customer interactions, alongside broader policies designed to ensure no customer would ever again be judged by the condition of their coat or the bus pass tucked into their bag. Posters in the break room reminded staff that respect was not optional and was not reserved only for customers who looked a certain way or carried a certain kind of bag. Senior leadership sat through the same training as the newest hires, a detail that surprised more than a few employees who had never imagined their bosses doing anything quite so humbling. The transformation had not come easily, and it had certainly not come willingly at first, born as it was out of fear of further embarrassment rather than any sudden change of heart. But slowly, through repetition and accountability, something genuine began to take root in the culture of that branch, something that outlasted the initial scramble of panic and apology. Martha returned to that same bank one more time, though not for the reasons anyone might have expected from a woman who had every right to walk away and never look back. She did not come back seeking revenge, and she made no further demands of the institution that had wronged her so publicly. Instead, she arrived to announce the launch of a new scholarship and vocational training program, funded entirely through her foundation, designed specifically to support older adults and people of color seeking new opportunities in finance and small business ownership. She had spent the weeks since the incident not nursing her own grievance, but designing something that might prevent the next person from ever standing where she had stood that morning, folder in hand, dignity questioned by a stranger who knew nothing about her life. The program would offer evening courses for adults returning to the workforce later in life, mentorship pairings with professionals willing to open doors the way no one had once opened a door for her and Walter, and small startup grants for people trying to build something of their own from almost nothing, the same way she once had. She had chosen the name for the program carefully, calling it simply the Open Door Initiative, a quiet nod to every door that had ever closed in her face, and every door she now intended to hold open for someone else. Reporters who had gathered outside, drawn by word of the morning's events leaking into the local news cycle, asked her afterward why she had chosen forgiveness over a lawsuit, and she answered only that punishing one young woman would have changed nothing for the next 100 people walking through doors just like that one. Standing once more in that same marble lobby, surrounded now by employees who greeted her with genuine warmth instead of suspicion, Martha delivered a message that many of them would carry with them long after that morning faded from memory. The greatest wealth a person can hold, she said, her voice carrying the same calm steadiness it always had, is not what sits inside a bank account. It is found in how we choose to treat one another when no one expects us to be watched. The room listened in complete silence. Several employees, glancing instinctively toward the spot near the window where she had once stood, waiting for over an hour without complaint. David Reyes, recognized for the quiet decency he had shown when almost no one else in that building had been willing to act, was promoted to branch manager not long afterward. A small but meaningful sign that the culture inside those walls had genuinely begun to shift towards something better. He would later say, to anyone who asked, that he had not done anything heroic that morning, only what should have been the most basic, obvious thing to do, and that it troubled him deeply that doing it had ever felt remarkable in the first place. The bank's leadership, chastened by everything the incident had exposed about their own institution, committed publicly to rebuilding trust with the communities they had so carelessly failed, and slowly, imperfectly, they began to follow through on that promise. As Martha finally stepped back out through the same revolving doors she had entered that phaeton, the same space that had once humiliated her, now offering something close to reverence in return. Outside, the old public bus rolled up to its usual stop along the curb, exactly on schedule, exactly as it always had, indifferent to everything that had happened inside the glass tower behind it. Martha climbed the steps slowly, found her familiar seat near the window, and watched the glass tower of the bank shrink behind her as the bus pulled away into the flow of the city, carrying her back toward the quiet street where she had lived for over 30 years. There was no anger left on her face, no trace of the sting she had carried earlier that morning, no bitterness in the way she folded her hands now empty in her lap, the folder safely back inside her bag where it belonged. Only a calm, quiet peace settled over her features as the city rolled past the glass, the same patient peace she had carried with her through every door that had ever tried to close in her face, through every loan officer who had looked past her decades ago, through every quiet slight she had absorbed and outlasted, without ever once raising her voice to match someone else's cruelty. Somewhere behind her, in the glass tower receding into the skyline, a young teller who had once snatched a folder from her hands was already learning to rebuild a life she had not expected to lose in a single morning. And a quiet, steady man who had simply knelt down to help was stepping into a new role he had never sought but had clearly earned. Martha thought of none of it with malice as the bus carried her homeward, only with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched a long, slow lesson finally land where it needed to land. The city outside her window kept moving the way it always had, indifferent and constant, the same buildings, the same crowded sidewalks, the same flower vendor on the same corner setting up his cart for another ordinary day. It was the same peace she would carry with her, unshaken, through every door still waiting to open in whatever years remained ahead of her, because she had long ago learned the one truth that no slap, no insult, and no stranger's careless judgment could ever take from her, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's willingness to see it. She had spent a lifetime proving that lesson quietly, without needing applause for it, and she intended to spend whatever years remained doing exactly the same thing, one folder, one open door, one small act of dignity at a time.